All right, and we're going to continue our second presentation into ecosystems, delving in them a little more deeply. We're going to start with looking at populations. Populations within an ecosystem, remember, are all of the organisms of a single species living together in the same time in the same place. A bunch of populations together make up a community, and the community, including when you add that to the abiotic factors, the weather, the rainfall, the temperature, all of that, the soil, then that becomes your ecosystem. So populations are an important part of ecosystems. And populations change over time. They go through evolution, through natural selection, but they also go through random changes, which we're going to see this on this slide. So population genetics can change for a number of reasons. One, natural selection is always acting. A natural selection is a process through which alleles that negatively affect reproduction are removed. That means any trait that is genetically controlled, that is in a population, if that trait negatively impacts reproduction, whether that's because it negatively impacts survival, because you have to be alive to reproduce, or it just reduces like the number or viability of offspring that are produced, then that allele will eventually be removed because the individuals that possess that gene, an allele is just a version of a gene, if they possess that gene, then they're not reproducing as much as the other animals, which means in the next generation, there'll be fewer of those animals present because they won't have reproduced as much. And then the next generation, there'll be even fewer because their offspring won't produce as much. So you end up with that allele eventually being removed. Now, if it's a recessive allele, it might not be completely removed because it can hide in the heterozygote. You learned all of that in biology. So that's natural selection. Natural selection can only act to remove things that harm the success of an organism. It does work sort of in the opposite. If you have a gene that benefits your survival and thus your reproduction or your reproduction, then that gene will be propagated over time. More and more organisms will have it in subsequent generations. Additionally, though, populations are affected by random events. These random events are called genetic drift. And when genetic drift occurs, it can cause a substantial loss of genetic variation. And in environmental science, we're concerned about this oftentimes because of what humans are doing. So like humans can randomly harm a group of a population, and that can reduce the amount of genetic variation, which makes it harder for that species to survive and reproduce in the future. When populations get down to a very small population, these random changes have an even bigger effect. These genetic drift events are more dramatic because there are just fewer organisms. So it's more likely that you remove very important genetic variation. A couple of specific examples of genetic drift are the bottleneck effect, and that's like where you have a big population and then some event happens and it suddenly becomes much smaller, like a bottleneck. That removes a bunch of genetic variation because you've had all these organisms and then they've all died out. Now you've just got this small population there. Bottlenecks have happened multiple times in history in terms of the whole biodiversity of the earth, right? Think like when the dinosaurs died out, right? That was a huge bottleneck event that wiped out like 95% of life on earth. So a lot of genetic variation was lost. Then we lost species, entire groups of species, sometimes entire families of species. It's kind of crazy. And then similar to that, there's the founder effect, and that's when you have new populations. It's a similar idea that you had a larger population over in one location, but then a small group of that breaks off and travels to some new area that population has never lived in before. Well, now that's going to grow. That population will grow into a bigger population, but the genetic variation here is limited by the individuals that actually founded the population, by the individuals that were here. So say, for example, here you had, uh, really big trees and small trees and really huge trees and then like medium-sized trees. You had lots of different sized trees. And then like humans came and we took seeds and brought them over to this new area and found a new population, but we only brought the really big seeds. Well, then years and years later, when that founder population grows into an even bigger population, you're still only going to have really big trees because that's the only genes that we brought over when we established that population. So that's the founder effect. Similar to the bottleneck effect, it's just that it's not reduced for some sort of dramatic reason or tragic reason. It's reduced because of who went to the new habitat. Of all of these changes, only natural selection is adaptive. So only natural selection is actually going to make animals more fit to their environment, and plants too, because plants go through the same process. Those drift effects are random. They're just driven by chance, like it's like a roll of the dice. Natural selection is always going to move to increase what we call fitness, which, remember, biological fitness is all about reproduction. It's the contribution of an individual to the gene pool relative to the contribution of others, meaning who has the most babies. Those who have the most babies are the most biologically fit. They're the most biologically successful. And that's true for plants and animals. So we don't often think about plants as evolving and going through competition and all of this, but plants are hugely competitive. They have to compete for sunlight, they have to compete for nutrients, they have to compete for water, and there's actually a ton of like most of the chemicals that are present in plants are actually there in order to help them to compete for natural resources. And so they're also going through evolution and natural selection. It's just because, they're not as cute and cuddly, we don't think about it as often. So all of this together sometimes leads to what we call the ecological arms race. This is the idea of co-evolution, when animals and plants, or different animals, when they are in a strong relationship, in a very integrated relationship within the ecosystem, then you get co-evolution. The example here is that the cheetah is the fastest land animal on Earth. A close second is probably the gazelle, because as cheetahs get faster and faster and faster, like as the fastest cheetahs are the ones to catch the gazelles, well, they're catching the slow gazelles, right? And so that makes the gazelle species get faster and faster and faster on average. So they're in, like an arms race. They're trying to get faster and faster. This is not actually a bug here. This is a flower. This is an orchid that the parts of the orchid, the petals, have over time been evolved to look like a female wasp sitting on there in order to attract other wasps, particularly male wasps, so that they will come and pollinate the flower. So they'll come land on this flower, they'll pick up some of the pollen, and then they'll go, and then they'll be tricked into landing on another flower, and that will cause pollination. So this is an example of a plant that's gone through some pretty extensive natural selection in relation to its main pollinator, the wasp. So these are really strong relationships within an ecosystem, really strong ways in which species interact that have driven their evolution over time. Species also interact in competitive ways, right? Not just coevolution or helpful ways, but they also act in competitive ways. And that can affect what we call an animal's niche. A niche is the role that an animal or plant, so an organism, plays in its ecosystem. Another way to look at it is the sum of the resources that an organism uses within its ecosystem. And that's like everything, right? It's not just where it lives. So it's more than just its habitat. It's where it lives. It's what it eats. It's how much it drinks. It's, what it needs in order to promote reproduction. It's like everything that it needs, all of the resources that it consumes within its ecosystem. And some species have broad niches, while others have more narrow niches. So this green one here, this is a broader niche. See, it takes up a wider area, so it's able to use a lot more resources than this species, which has a much narrower niche. That relates to a generalist species versus a specialist species. Generalist species have really broad niches. They're going to be really broad. They're going to be able to use a wide variety of resources, whereas a specialist is going to have a very narrow niche. It's going to only be able to use certain resources. So here we have a picture of all of these different wading birds. They have very specialized beaks for obtaining very certain kinds of food, and so these would be very narrow niches or very specialist species. Whereas things like cockroaches and mice, they can survive off of a wide variety of resources, raccoons as well. So these are what we would call generalist species, right? They have a very wide niche. So their approach to life is different. When you have lots and lots of competition, you tend to get more specialization because that limits competition. But the generalists are better able to deal with change in their environment because they can utilize a wider variety of resources. Going back to the graph, we see here's species 1 who is a very strong competitor, and here's species 2 who's not so strong. He's a weak competitor. They have an area where their niche overlaps. This is where competition happens because they can utilize the same resources here. This is the same part of the ecosystem that they can use. They can both utilize this. So here you're going to have competition. You always have competition where niches overlap. And because this species one is a stronger competitor, that's going to push species two out of this area because they're going to outcompete species two, which is going to push them closer that way, making species two actual existence in a smaller range than it could exist in if the species one wasn't there. That's the difference between a fundamental niche and a realized niche. A fundamental niche is hypothetically all of the resources that an organism would use. A realized niche is in reality, when you take into account competition, what resources does that organism use? And so that realized niche is usually smaller than the fundamental niche because of competition. Um, and all of this helps to sort of push organisms to natural selection, to specialize if they're in very competitive areas, or to stay broad if they have that broad niche and they're a strong competitor. All this natural selection, though, it's limited to what the organism has genetic traits for. You have to have the genes before the environmental condition comes about. You can't, like, just because it floods in New Orleans doesn't mean suddenly everyone's going to grow gills. The ability to grow gills would have to be in our population already. And also for many animals, both generalist and specialist species, were limited by reproductive capability. If you can only reproduce once every 10 years, your species isn't going to be able to adapt very quickly, even if they're a generalist species, because your reproductive lag is pretty large. But if you reproduce quickly and in large numbers, you're better able to adapt because you are, even if you're a specialist species, because you have more opportunities for changing the genes. Sometimes these interactions lead to die out of species. Extinction is not something that doesn't happen naturally. It is a natural event. There are two different kinds of extinction. There's biological extinction, which means everything that's like of that species that's ever lived on Earth is dead. And then you have local extinction, where like in a particular area, certain populations die out. So, for example, alligators have been endangered in specific areas, although overall their species is really doing fairly well. So but they've been in danger of local extinction. Species that are what we call endemic species are more likely to undergo extinction events because they're only found in one area, and so they're particularly vulnerable. There is a background level of extinction, sort of a natural, typically low rate of extinction over the course of the years that just happens through natural selection. But we have what are called mass extinction events that have also happened through our history, and we've had 3 to 5 of them over about 500 million years, where large numbers, as much as 95% of all the animals on Earth, have died out. Many scientists think we're in the middle of a sixth large extinction, mass extinction right now, and it's different in nature than all the other ones because it's being caused by humans. So one species is actually causing all of these other species to die out. And so that's a really big problem in terms of biodiversity. And so extinction is part of figuring out how much biodiversity we have, because we create new species, that's speciation, and then extinction happens and species die out, and that leads to biodiversity, the number of species that we actually have. And there are two really ways that we measure biodiversity. There's species richness, which is just the sheer number of individuals in a community, and then there's a relative number of different species that we have in a community. And then there's relative abundance, which is like how even those species are. So another way to write this would be species evenness, right? How evenly are the populations of those different species distributed? So here we have two different forests. Both of them have the same number of species richness. They both have 5 different species of tree. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But one of these seems more diverse than the other one, right? This one is not very evenly. Its relative abundance is pretty low, right? It's mostly this green puffy tree, but a few of the other trees. Whereas this one has a high level, it has 5 different tree species, but it also has a high level of species evenness. They're all about the same number of each kind of tree. Here's a more realistic example, right? Both of these could have similar amounts of biodiversity, but they have definitely different amounts of species richness. So the species richness could be the same, but the species evenness is certainly very different. And so those are just some real life examples of that. So that's coming into how we measure biodiversity, which is an activity that we're going to work on soon in class.